Scholastic Audio presents Spirit Animals, Book 3, Blood Ties, by Garth Nix and Sean Williams. Read for you by Nicola Barber. Chapter 1. The Great Bamboo Maze. The bamboo rose above Mei Lin, far above, blocking out the sun and casting deep shadows on the intersection of two narrow paths below. Mei Lin stopped and glared at yet another crossroad in the great bamboo maze, yet another choice of ways. She did not want to admit, not even to herself, that she had gone wrong somewhere several miles back, and was now hopelessly lost. It had seemed like such a good idea when she first thought of reaching Zhong through the maze. The bamboo forest had been specially grown as a defense where the wall did not run, and only selected messengers and senior officials knew the secret ways through the miles and miles of 50-foot-high bamboo. Mei Lin's father, General Teng, knew the secrets, of course, and long ago he had told Mei Lin how to get through from the northern entrance. "Always turn left the first 10 times, whispered Mei Lin to herself. Then 10 turns always right, then left, right, left, 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 right, right, right. But she had followed those instructions and had not found herself on the other side of the maze. Even worse, she had counted on getting through in the single day it was supposed to take. The leather bottle of water she had filled from a stream at the entrance, plus 2 rice cakes, should have been easily enough to sustain her. Now it was the morning of the 3rd day. Her water bottle was empty, and the rice cakes were distant memories. This, coming at the end of a weeks-long trek by boat and caravan across Europe, often smuggled away in dusty crates and rat-infested holds, left her feeling frustrated at her failure, as well as hungry and thirsty. Only the distant hope that her father might still be alive, and that she might somehow live long enough to find him, kept her from giving up. Angrily, Mei Lin struck the stem of the nearest bamboo with her quarterstaff, the blow so powerful that it cracked the 4-inch thick bowl. The bamboo fell among its fellows, but there were so many, it might never have been there in the first place. There was nothing but impossibly tall bamboo all around, the narrow path, the sun high above. For the first time, Mei Lin thought she might actually die in the maze. The daughter of General Teng, to die of thirst in a bamboo forest? It was unbearable. An itch on her forearm diverted Mei Lin's thoughts. She slid up her sleeve and looked at the tattoo of a sleepy panda. She had kept her spirit animal, Ji, in her dormant state in the great bamboo maze, fearing the panda would hold her back. Now, that was the least of Mei Lin's concerns. "Come on then," ordered Mei Lin. "Come out and do something useful. Maybe you could eat a way through the bamboo for me." There was a flash of light and sudden movement. A furry weight pressed into her side as Ji appeared and leaned against her, pushing her against the closest stand of bamboo, making it shake. "Hey, watch it!" protested Mei Lin. She felt something touch her face and, thinking it an insect, brushed it aside, only to feel more of whatever it was land on her hand. She looked up and saw delicate white flowers falling from the tips of the bamboo high above, like tiny warm snowflakes. Bamboo flowers. Mei Lin had never seen bamboo flowers before. She knew the plants only flowered once every 50 or 60 or even 100 years, and then they died. All the bamboo plants, all at once. "The maze is dying," she whispered, staring up at the tops of the bamboo. Every stand of bamboo she could see was flowering. In a week or two, The bamboo would begin to dry out, crack and fall. Before that, the floor of the forest would be covered in flowers, attracting great hordes of rats and other animals to this once-in-a-century feast. With the maze gone, yet more of Zhong would be completely unprotected. The conquerors had overrun her poor country through the wall, and now even its lesser defences were being torn away. Perhaps even this flowering had been caused by the devourer somehow. Ji sat down heavily and reached up to drag Mei Lin down next to her with one big paw. "I can't sit down," protested Mei Lin. "I have to find a way out." She pushed the panda's paw aside and took a few steps along the left-hand path. Then she hesitated, turned, and took a few steps along the right-hand path. Ji made a kind of snuffling noise. "Are you laughing?" demanded Mei Lin. "This is very serious. I'm lost. I have no food or water. I could die here." Ji patted the ground next to her. It was a very human gesture, and it reminded Mei Lin of her father when he wanted her to sit next to him and receive some wisdom. What she wouldn't have given to see him now. "I haven't got time to sit down," she rasped. "Come on." It really didn't matter what path she took now, Mei Lin thought. She was totally lost. What was important now was speed. She had to get out of the maze before she died of starvation and thirst. She set off at a loping run, sure that this time there would be an opening in the tight ranks of bamboo, that the path would lead to a clearing, that she would be in the open lands of Zhong. Ji made another noise behind her, but Mei Lin ignored it. Once again her spirit animal was proving useless. If only she had Essex, the falcon could fly up and spot the way out. You would think a panda might be of some use in a bamboo forest, muttered Mei Lin. She ran on another 50 yards and came to yet another intersection of paths. She could go left, right, or straight ahead. They all looked exactly the same. Long, narrow tracks between great stands of bamboo. Mei Lin stopped and looked back. Ji was following her slowly but steadfastly. As the girl looked, the panda reached up and pulled down a bamboo stem, effortlessly bending it until it broke. The topmost stems came down near the path just behind the girl, showering her once again with flowers. Ji sauntered along and began to eat, stuffing huge pawfuls of bamboo stems, leaves and flowers into her mouth. Mei Lin felt her own hunger, a pain in her middle that was difficult to ignore. Her mouth would have watered, but it was too dry. She had tried eating the bamboo on the second day, and it had caused stomach cramps that only made her feel hungrier. It was too dry, and there were no soft, new shoots that would have been easier to digest. "There has to be a way out," she whispered. She looked wildly at the different paths. There really was no difference between them. She had gone right last time. Now she would go left, Mei Lin thought. Left, and then right at the next intersection, and so on. Zigzagging, that would work. She would get somewhere that way. "Come on," she said to Ji. This time, Mei Lin didn't run. She just didn't have the energy anymore. But she walked fast, ignoring her hunger pains and rasping throat, the heat and the humidity. "I will find a way out," she whispered. "I will get to Zhong. I will fight the devourer and our enemies." But against that, there was a small voice in her head that whispered a hopeless, constantly repeating thought. "I'm going to die. I'm lost, and I'm going to die." Chapter 2. A Message from the Sea. Connor hunched down in the forepeak of the Tellen's Pride, the fastest ship in the Green Cloak fleet. He was drenched with spray every minute or so as the ship crashed through each rolling wave, but at least he could be alone in his misery. Being wet just felt like a small, suitable punishment for what he had done. giving up the iron-bored talisman of Rumfus to the enemy, even though he still felt like he had no choice. He had to do it to save his family. Connor felt hopeless and ashamed. Not for the first time, Connor wondered if there had been some kind of cosmic mistake. Surely he was meant to be a shepherd and nothing more. He shouldn't be a green cloak, and he shouldn't have one of the great beasts as his spirit animal. He just wasn't cut out to be a hero, and Erdus needed real heroes to obtain the talismans of the great beasts and defeat the Devourer. Sharp teeth gently touched the back of his neck. He knew those teeth. It was Briggan, grabbing him by the collar to pull him out of his hidey hole, as if he were an errant cub. "I'm coming, he said with a sigh. The wolf let him go and backed up along the deck. "What is it?" Briggan turned and went toward the ladder down from the forecastle to the main deck, his claws clattering. At the top of the ladder he looked back, his piercing blue eyes on Connor. Connor looked past the wolf. Tariq, Rolan and Abeka were standing, facing each other, just behind the mainmast, in a semicircle that had 2 obvious gaps. At least, they were obvious to him. One was his own place, and he supposed Briggan had come to drag him there. The other empty spot was Mei Lin's. Mei Lin, who would never have gone off all alone to Zhong if Connor hadn't given in to the Earl of Trunswick and ruined everything. He considered his companions for a moment. Tariq really was a hero already, their mentor and guide, an experienced older greencloak. Next to him, with that typical grin on his face, was Rolan, the smart-mouthed city boy. He didn't look like he was paying attention to Tariq. Unlike Abeka. She was serious. She liked to do things properly. But she had been kinder to Connor than the others after he had failed them. Perhaps her calm center came from being a hunter. Abeka was patient with people as well as animals. "Ah, Connor, come and join us," called out Tariq. "We're going to try scaling the mast again, using Arax's talisman. You can go first." "I thought it was Abeka's turn to go first," said Rolan, with a thinly veiled glance of contempt at Connor. Connor winced. He'd once thought Rolan a friend. But not anymore. Not since Mei Lin left. "Yes, it's Abeka's turn," Connor said. "She's better at jumping than I am anyway." "That's why we practice," said Tariq patiently. "You'll need all your skills when we go after the next talisman." "What is the next talisman?" said Abeka. "We don't know where another one is." "And even if we get it," said Rolan, "Connor will probably just give it to the conquerors anyway." "Enough of that," said Tariq. "I am sure there will be news of one of the other great beasts when we get back to Greenhaven. Lenori will have found one for sure." "I am sorry," said Connor, hating the way Rolan wouldn't meet his eye. "You know I am, but my family—" "You people and your families," muttered Rolan. "It almost makes me glad mine ditched me early." "The people we love are our strengths," said Abeka. "But they are our weakness too. When their lives are at stake, it is hard to know what is right." The concession seemed to surprise Rolan as much as it surprised Connor. "You're letting him off the hook?" "I say only that we should try to understand." Abeka's glare was for both of them. "All lives are in danger until the conquerors are defeated. All families, including my own." That was a rebuke, one Connor felt he deserved. He bit his lip and reached for Briggan and the reassurance of the wolf's furry neck. But his fingers met empty air. Briggan had moved away. Maybe it was just because the ship had met another wave, bigger than usual. But it felt to Connor as if even his spirit animal didn't want to be associated with him too closely. "Abeka's right," said Tariq. He spoke calmly, as always, but with considerable force.
hence the importance of training. Here is the talisman. See how quickly you can reach the main top."
"With Uraza's help?" asked Rebecca. Her leopard was dormant, a tattoo on her forearm. Uraza was not keen on the sea. Tariq shook his head.
"Not this time. See what you can do just jumping with the talisman."
Rebecca nodded. Connor looked up, worried for her. The main top was a small platform only 10 feet short of the mainmast's imposing 80-foot height. It was reached by climbing up the ratlines, narrow nets of rope-like ladders that ran up from the deck. But what they had been practicing was jumping straight from the deck to the first spar or crosspiece that went across the mast. This was 30 feet from the deck. It was made even more difficult by the plunging and rolling of the ship. If Rebecca fell, Connor hoped she would try to aim for the sea. Better to fall in the water than be smashed on the deck. Unless she landed on one of the rockback whales pulling the ship, of course.
"Focus,"
Tariq told her.
"Concentrate on drawing the talisman's power. Aim for the exact spot you want on the spar, and have your hands ready to take hold when you land."
Rebecca stretched her shoulders, then her calves. Uraza was astonishingly dexterous, able to change direction even in mid-air. Connor didn't know how Rebecca would fare without her.
"Go,"
said Tariq as the ship settled down in the trough on the far side of a wave. Rebecca jumped. The astonishing power of the granite ram propelled her upward with thrilling acceleration. She was headed straight up, like a perfectly shot arrow. And then Connor realized that she was going too fast, jumping too high. She was going to hurl way past the first spar. In fact, she was going to go over the top of the mast, miss all the ropes, the spars, everything, and go plummeting down the other side. Connor gasped as she desperately tucked in her knees and did a somersault in the air to slow herself down. Then, just as she cleared the very top of the mast, she stretched out, reached across, and gripped the thin rope there, the flag halyard used for raising the standard of the Greencloaks, guardians of Erdos. For a second, Connor thought it might break, and he would watch Rebecca go hurtling on her way to certain death. But the rope held. Rebecca swung around the mast and struck her shins against a horizontal spar. Her grip slipped a yard down the rope before she caught herself, swinging back the other way. The same wooden spar almost cracked her across the head. She avoided it only by executing an inelegant but effective somersault and kicking her feet against the spar. Finally, she slowed enough to climb down to the main top. There, she looked back to the deck 70 feet below. She waved, and Connor waved back with relief.
"That's one powerful talisman," said Roland. "It responds to Rebecca's natural gifts,"
said Tariq, nodding in approval.
"I guess so," said Roland. "Hard to see what use a wolf will be up there, eh, Connor?"
Before Connor could decide if that was supposed to be a joke or not, Roland looked up. Essex, who had taken to perching on one of the stays that supported the mainmast, suddenly launched into the air with a long, falling cry. "Has she seen something?" Connor asked. Roland pointed off to port, across the white-touched blue sea, toward the curved horizon.
"There, a bird, I think."
Tariq was shielding his eyes with his hand and looking as well.
"I can't see anything." "Yes, a little black and white bird, flying low," Roland went on. "It's kind of skipping over the waves, coming straight for us. Essex can't be hungry, can she? I fed her this morning." "It's a stormy petrel," said Tariq. "A messenger bird, like the pigeons of Yora. From Olvan or Lenori, I would guess." A thud on the deck behind them made everyone turn. Rebecca was there, crouched on one knee, one hand on the deck. "I climbed down and then jumped from the lowest spar," she said excitedly. "I knew I could do it. The talisman slowed me as I fell, like a feather drifting. Who's up next?" "I think we'll take a break," said Tariq. "We have a message." I heard a song about stormy petrels once, said Roland guardedly. Don't they bring storms or bad luck?
Connor, who had been straining to see, finally made out a little bird rising up from the sea. It looked like it was bouncing off a wave. The petrel paused on the rail, then skittered to Tariq's hand. Essex flew overhead and landed on Roland's shoulder, fierce amber eyes meeting the petrel's darting black ones. Tariq carefully removed a tiny bronze capsule from the petrel's leg and held the bird up. It made a squeaking, chattering sound and flew back to the open sea.
There's a message in there? Asked Connor. It looks too small.
Tariq nodded and twisted the tiny capsule apart. Inside was a scroll the size of his little fingernail. He took it out and unfurled it to a surprising length.
Onion skin paper,
he said.
Is it about Mei Lin? Asked Connor.
He really hoped she was all right. They had been on a scouting mission for a week to take their minds off the missing girl, as well as to train them in seacraft. It hadn't worked. If only there was good news that she was safe in Zhong with the green cloaks there, or returning safely to them even now.
In part, said Tariq. It is from Ulven. No news of Mei Lin. Positive report on location of Dinesh. New orders. Go to Ko Kenzit. Rendezvous messenger at Inn of the Bright Moon, outside East Gate of Shin Kao Dai. But beware, enemy holds city. Good luck. Where now? Asked Roland. I thought we were going back to Greenhaven, or at least somewhere warm. Ko Kenzit is an outlying region of Zhong, said Tariq.
Lumio, his spirit animal, mimicked his frown, his little otter face all scrunched up.
Shin Kao Dai is the closest port.
We can't just sail into enemy territory, said Connor. We'd need an army.
It's a busy port, with travellers from all over, said Tariq. If we disguise ourselves and get put ashore at night in one of the ship's boats.
I'm good with disguises, said Roland. There's a clothing box in the first mate's cabin. There's bound to be some cloaks that aren't green, plus other stuff we can use. Hey, we could dress up as minstrels. They always seem to come and go without any problems.
We don't have any instruments, said Tariq, nor the skill to play them.
What about shadow puppets? Suggested Connor. A troupe visited Trunswick once. We'd only need a big sheet. We could borrow a sail, cut out some figures, and get a big lantern. The troupe I saw did a show about all the different kinds of sheep, you know. A Mayan black belly, Yoran long-haired white. Sheep puppets? Exclaimed Roland, as though he'd never heard anything more ridiculous.
We will have a day to think of something, with the whales at full stretch, Tariq said. I'll ask the captain when I inform him of the course change. He may have an idea we haven't thought of.
Abeka was rereading the message. Dinesh is the elephant, isn't he? She said, pointing at the tiny script. I mean, the elephant. The great beast.
Yes, said Tariq. Keeper of the slate elephant talisman, which we must obtain.
Abeka looked at Connor.
We'll keep this one when we get it, right?
Said Roland.
Connor nodded miserably. Of course we will, said Tariq. But for now, you should resume your practice while the sea is relatively calm. Who's next?
You go, blurted Connor to Roland. I feel a bit seasick suddenly. I have to go lie down.
He turned and stumbled away, almost falling over Briggan before dragging himself alongside the rail to the aft companionway, and then down to the cabins below. The wolf patiently followed at his heels. Connor didn't really feel seasick. He just felt ashamed. How could he practice when it was clear Roland didn't trust him? Tariq and Abeka were trying, he could tell, but not Roland. Every time Connor said something, Roland was quick to put him back in his place. How could he help get a new talisman from another great beast when Roland wouldn't let him forget how horribly wrong everything had gone with the iron boar? Adding to his misery was the thought of sneaking into occupied territory, one of a handful of people against the full might of the conquerors. Connor wasn't a coward, but what might happen if they were caught was too horrible to contemplate. He wasn't just worried about himself, but about Briggan too, and the people he had come to think of as friends, no matter what they thought of him. They would all have to contribute. There wouldn't be room for mistakes. "I'll do whatever it takes," he whispered to Briggan as he sat on his narrow bunk and drew the wolf close. "I'll show them I can be a real Greencloak."
Chapter 3. Shin Kao Dai.
Shin Kao Dai,
the captain of the Tellen's Pride had said.
A pretty harbour, but prone to morning fogs this time of year. There's a small island very near the southern headland. We can stand off after midnight, row you to the island, and you can wade ashore at low tide. Cross the fish traps and you'll make landfall easily in the fisherfolk's part of the city.
Thinking of the captain's words 2 mornings later, Roland wished they'd come up with a plan that didn't involve getting so wretchedly wet. Captain Darish had been right about the fog. It wove around Roland, thick and grey, shrouding the first faint rays of the sun. He wasn't cold, which was a surprise. He'd never encountered a warm fog before. But that didn't make him any less uncomfortable. The moisture was always pooling into droplets that trickled down the back of his neck and into his ears. When it dripped into his eyes, he had to blink and shake his head to fling the droplets away. The sea was also warm, a detail that Roland told himself to be glad of, since he was in it up to his waist.
"Whose great idea was this anyway?"
he muttered, doing his best to keep up with Tariq. Connor was following Roland, and Abeka brought up the rear. All 4 of them had large shadow puppets strapped in bundles across their backs, the pieces of bodies and limbs poking above their heads and out to the sides. Tariq carried a great storm lantern strapped atop his pack. The idea of telling the story of the fallen had been Abeka's. She had described seeing such performances in Nilo, one with a Gorathon that had been made of no less than 30 segments, able to writhe and slide and open its mouth to devour everything in its path. That detail hadn't thrilled Tariq. The screen was by far the heaviest single piece, and Connor had volunteered to carry it, perhaps hoping it would make the others think better of him. Roland didn't really understand why the shepherd had handed over the talisman to the conquerors, since he didn't have a family himself. He didn't get why Mei Lin had chosen to run off either, to save someone who might already be dead for all she knew. None of it made any sense at all to Roland, who was just trying to keep his head above water, metaphorically as well as literally at that moment.
"How far to the mainland?"
he asked Tariq, keeping his voice low so it didn't carry across the water. The fog was so thick that he could only see a few paces ahead. They were all nervous about creeping into Zhong, where one mistake could leave them captives of the conquerors. But on the other hand, Mei Lin was in Zhong, somewhere. Roland frowned as he found himself wondering where she was, and how soon he might see her again. He shook his head, trying to make the picture of Mei Lin in his head go away. This was no time to be thinking about someone who had chosen to run off and leave him, or leave them.
"Are you all right?" asked Connor. "Water in my ear," growled Roland. "Almost there," said Tariq. "I can see fish traps ahead." "Are they dangerous?"
Roland had never seen one.
"Only to fish." "You sure?" he said. "That'd be almost too easy." His right foot sank deep into an underwater hole, and suddenly the surface of the sea came a lot closer to neck level than he liked. Splashing and spluttering, he barely managed to avoid falling face forward, and was only hauled upright by strong hands from behind him. Connor.
Are you all right?
Rebecca's voice called from farther back. Roland pulled away from Connor.
Can everybody stop asking if I'm all right? I'm fine.
He was fine, now that he had both feet back on the seabed. Annoyed, but not hurt in any way. Roland knew he should thank Connor for helping him, but everything was too raw and complicated. All he wanted was to get out of the water and onto dry land, where he could run from the things that tried to hurt him, instead of splashing along at a painfully slow pace. But at least he'd stopped thinking about Mei Lin.
We must keep moving, said Tariq. We need to be ashore and past the fisher folks' huts before the fog lifts.
The green cloak set a much quicker pace, and Roland struggled to keep up, now wary of invisible sinkholes and fish traps.
Remember, keep your sleeves down and tied at the wrist to hide your tattoos, Tariq said. Call your spirit animals only if it is a matter of life or death. Obviously, this doesn't include you, Roland. Hunting birds are common here, but I doubt normal for a troop of puppeteers. So if Essex will stay aloft...
Roland wasn't promising anything. He was still embarrassed that he couldn't get Essex to adopt the dormant form. But at least the falcon could fly around without attracting attention. She was up there somewhere now, above the fog. The fish traps turned out to be man-high, wickerwork tubes set into the sand. There were dozens of them, placed only a few feet apart, so they formed a kind of strange forest emerging from the sea. Tariq led the way between the traps, which were full of flopping silver fish that had entered on the high tide and now couldn't get out. The others followed him, moving faster as they waded steadily into shallower water. Soon they left the sea itself behind, dripping and splashing as quietly as they could. The light was rising as the sun threatened to breach the eastern horizon. Through the muddy light, Roland made out a gently sloping, sandy beach, lined with drawn-up fishing boats. Behind the boats, a few dark outlines of houses could be seen through the fog. There was a taller structure to their left, at the other end of the beach. A watchtower, fortunately still heavily shrouded by fog, so that only its lower wall was visible and the faint red glow from the torches burning. Tariq waved them on. They were painfully exposed on the beach. Hurrying up the sand, they followed a track that led to a line of fisherfolks' houses. If they weren't under cover by the time the sun burned the mist away, they'd be out of the fish traps and into a prison cell. Upon reaching the houses, Tariq changed direction suddenly, leaving the track to hurry along behind a wall. The others went with him, Rebecca only just reaching the shadowed wall as 3 fisherfolk came out of the swirling fog and started down to the beach with baskets on their backs and fish spears in their hands. Red-tinged light spread through the fog. At the same time, Roland had a momentary vision of the sun, a bright sliver of it above the horizon. He was seeing it from somewhere above the mist, through eyes much keener than his. He blinked and realized with a shock that the image had come from Essex. He was seeing through the falcon's eyes. Roland's jaw dropped open, unfortunately just in time to catch a passing fly. He spat it out, hardly noticing because he was so amazed at what had just happened. He had seen what Essex was seeing. Roland wanted to tell everyone, but it wasn't the right time. The sun was higher than expected. They were running later than they had planned. The working day of the city was about to begin. They had to get out of the fisherfolks' village and into the city proper before it was too late to merge with the crowd.
"We've got to move,"
Roland whispered to Tariq.
"Now."
"Maybe we should try to hide until nightfall," said Connor nervously. "If everyone goes out fishing, the houses will all be empty."
"That's a terrible idea," Roland snapped. "Families stay behind, and there might be patrols. We have to go now. The sun is up, and it'll burn off this fog really fast." "Roland's right," said Tariq. He looked around. "If we can move between the houses, Perhaps we can stay out of sight. The next quarter is a market. If we can get there—"
"Right," said Roland, taking charge. He wasn't going to wait around for any more of Connor's hopeless ideas.
"Follow me."
"Wait," said Tariq, gripping Roland's shoulder before he could move out.
"I'll go first. If we are seen by guards, you three can break off and run to safety." "Not going to happen," Roland said firmly. "No offense, Tariq, but even without your green cloak, you still stand out. Hang back and pretend to be our bodyguard or something."
Tariq lifted one shoulder and jutted out his jaw, simultaneously ducking his head and affecting a limp, taking on the perfect appearance of a brute. Roland wondered if Tariq had more street smarts than he had given him credit for. Roland nodded approvingly. He listened for a moment, then started off along the back of the house, the others following. All his senses were alert, and he felt very alive. It was good to be back in a city, even on the fringe of one he didn't know. He would show the others what he could do, starting by getting into the market quarter. He led the way behind 4 more simple wooden houses, and then a quick sprint through the fog to a line of posts where nets were hung for repair. Crawling under the suspended nets gave them perfect cover for a good 20 yards of easy travel. But then, even Roland was stumped. He held up his hand to halt everyone, and stared ahead. The fog was really clearing now. With the increased visibility, Roland saw there was a broad road ahead, separating the fishing village from the market stalls. People were already getting out their wares and exchanging shouted greetings about the fog. But right in the middle of the road, there were 2 guards, a man and a woman. They looked like typical city militia to Roland, in their badly kept leathers and dented helmets. But the woman had a spirit animal next to her, some kind of stoat, and that was not normal for a simple city guard. She had to be one of the Devourer's followers, one of the conquerors who had taken over Shin.
"What do we do now?" whispered Connor.
Roland held an impatient finger to his lips. That stoat might give the guard superior hearing, or it might notice them itself. He was thinking furiously. Abeka mimed shooting an arrow. Her bow and quiver of arrows were underneath the shadow puppets. Roland shook his head. Shooting guards in a city? That was a sure way to get caught. They had to be distracted somehow, not killed or wounded. He thought for a moment, slowly shrugged off his pack, and settled it on the ground behind him. The others clustered close, under the nets. "I'm going to distract the guards. When they're gone, just walk across the street and go into the market, carrying my pack. I'll meet you at the biggest pie seller."
"What if there isn't a pie seller?" whispered Connor.
"There's always a pie seller,"
Roland said indignantly.
"In Zhong?"
asked Abeka.
"I don't think they eat pies."
Roland hadn't thought of that. He was sure they ate something like pies. Tariq nudged him and pointed across the street to a tower standing tall above the market stalls, about half a mile in. Roland let out a short sigh of relief.
"Right, we'll meet on the shaded side of that tower. I'll find you. Essex will see you for sure." "It's risky," said Tariq, "but I see no choice. Take care of yourself, Roland." "I always do," said Roland with a confident wink.
He pulled out his knife and cut away a big square of fishing net, winding it around his head like a turban and letting a piece fall across his face. Then he took off his blue sailor's jacket and reversed it to show the paler underside before putting it back on again inside out.
"Wait till they run after me,"
he whispered, and walked out from under the nets, straight at the guards. They were talking together and didn't notice him at first, not until the stoat stiffened up and made a hissing noise. Roland let out a terrifying scream and staggered across into a stand on the edge of the market that was selling beads and necklaces. dragging down dozens of necklaces and spilling beads all across the road. He pointed at the stoat and screamed,
"It's spat poison in my eyes!"
The guards swore and advanced upon him, the stoat leaping ahead. Roland tipped over a basket of beads in front of them, dove under the storekeeper's reaching arms, and ran into the depths of the market, still howling,
"Poison! Poison!"
Chapter 4. Secret Signals. As soon as the guards ran after Roland, Tariq, Abeka, and Connor moved, sauntering across the road into the market. Their hearts were pounding, and all three felt sure that at any moment someone would shout. But no one was watching. Everyone nearby was staring at the trail of destruction left by Roland and the pursuing guards. By the time the market-goers turned back to their business, the three disguised greencloaks were standing in front of a hot food stall, waiting in line to buy a rice and meat mixture served on a green leaf. To Abeka it smelled delicious, much more enticing than the food on the ship.
"Hey, puppeteers,"
said the food seller, ladling the spicy mixture onto the laid-out leaves.
"Where are you doing your show? My daughter loves the shadow plays." "An inn outside the east gate," said Tariq. "Oh, the Bright Moon,"
said the food seller.
"Best rice wine in Kensit. Another reason to come see your show. There you are, 3 bits.
Tariq handed over 3 small silver coins, carefully chosen to be from Yora, Zhong, and Amaya.
"We've not been here long,"
he said conversationally as he handed the food to Connor and Abeka.
"I was worried by all this talk of the conquerors and the change of government, but everything seems quiet enough."
"All quiet here," said the food seller, suddenly looking down.
Move along, there's people waiting."
The trio left, joining the moving throngs of people. Abeka glanced back at the food seller and was alarmed to see him staring after her. She hoped he would put selling his wares ahead of alerting the guards to strangers. Something Tariq had said made the man suspicious. As the sun rose, more and more of the city folk came out to make their purchases in the market. The narrow lanes between the stalls became much more crowded, noisier and dustier.
"I hope Roland hasn't gotten himself caught,"
muttered Connor to Abeka as they approached the tower that dominated the centre of the market.
"He has been a bit distracted since Mei Lin left," said Abeka. "I mean, I'm sure he won't get caught. Fairly sure."
"We might all get caught,"
muttered Connor, casting anxious eyes over toward a pair of guards who were trying knives at a nearby stall.
"He said the shadowed side, didn't he?"
asked Abeka. She was beginning to get really worried. Where was Roland? She was just turning her head to the left when Roland popped up next to her. He was no longer wearing the fishnet turban, and his jacket was the right way out. As Abeka gaped at him, he took his own pack back and slung it over his shoulder.
"Thanks," he said. "You ready to head over to the east gate?"
"We are," said Tariq.
"The guards?" "Led them on a wild goose chase to a cesspit where the marketeers throw their trash. A particularly horrible one, judging by the smell. They, tripped and won't be going anywhere for a while. Well done, Roland."
Roland puffed up his chest.
"Follow me, then," he said.
"We must avoid being overconfident," Tariq warned, before Roland could dart off again. "Ask Essex to check the way ahead."
"I have."
"She must stay up high. If she's spotted as a spirit animal—"
"Don't worry, she's being careful,"
said Roland with a flash of irritation. But he did seem calmer, and that made Abeka feel less nervous in turn. Keeping a low profile was the priority. Stunts like the one Roland had just performed were dangerous, even if they were clever.
"That was quick thinking back there," she told him as they wandered through the market, pretending to be innocent passers-through. "I guess you had a lot of practice back in Concorba."
Roland made a rolling gesture with his hand, one way and then the other.
"What does that mean?" asked Abeka.
"Oh, it's a sign the street people use," he said. It means just a bit, or not so much.
We have hunting signs, said Abeka. It isn't possible to speak when the stalkers close on the prey.
Show me some, said Roland. I'll teach you the ones we used in Concorba.
They traded a Mayan and Niloan hand signals as they wove through the crowd. Some of the gestures were similar. A quick twist of his left hand meant pickpocket to Roland, but take cover to Abeka. Spying guards at one end of a laneway, Abeka pointed with 2 fingers over her head to an empty stall, and he understood her intentions immediately. She ducked through the stall and out the rear, followed closely by the others. A stall owner called out angrily to them as they passed. Abeka couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the look of hate in his eyes and the anxiety of the other nearby market-goers. Eventually they left the market quarter, and the itchy feeling along Abeka's spine began to ease slightly. They climbed up a zigzag road into a more prosperous quarter, where merchants had their permanent shops. The streets were still busy, so it was easy for the foursome to mingle with the moving crowd. But they still stood out, with clothes that were damp from their early morning wade, and disassembled puppets towering over their heads. When they neared the east gate, the foot traffic slowed and began to thin out. They could see the city wall running to the right and left, and the great gatehouse in the middle. A flag was flying above it, showing the blazon of the conquerors. The great gate beneath was only half open, one of its 2 leaves shut. Guards stood in the open space, inspecting everyone going in and out, a line of people patiently waiting on either side. "Remember your names," whispered Tariq. He meant their false names, practiced on the ship. "We're puppeteers, going to do a show at the Inn of the Bright Moon. Just stick to that." He stopped talking as the line inched forward. There were 6 guards in the gateway, actively inspecting travellers as they passed through. 2 of them had spirit animals, one a brutish, heavy-shouldered dog that sniffed every traveller, and the other a massive spider that sat on its partner's shoulder, a thick strand of web hanging from its spinnerets down her arm.
"Names and business,"
snapped the guard with the dog spirit animal.
"Moston," said Tariq. "Shadow puppeteer, going to do a show at the Inn of the Bright Moon. These are my apprentices, Ulk, Snan, and Pahan."
The dog sniffed at Tariq, then circled around and sniffed each of the others in turn. But it didn't then sit back on its haunches. Instead, it sniffed everyone again, most particularly Abeka. Then it looked up and growled at her.
"Smagish doesn't like you," growled the guard. "You smell funny."
"I just played with a kitten," she said quickly. "I wanted to buy it, but Moston wouldn't let me. Said we had to spend our silvers on something useful."
"Silvers?" asked the guard. "You got money?" "Of course," said Tariq. "They wanted 5 silvers for the kitten, which is robbery." "Vagrants with no money wandering around is robbery waiting to happen," said the guard. "Show me."
Tariq held out 5 silvers in his palm. The guard looked around, then scooped the coins up.
"That's a fine," he said, "for playing with cats and wasting my time. Off you go."
They started forward, but suddenly the woman with the spider spoke. "Wait," she said. Roland tensed, waiting for the spider to jump or for a sudden attack. But the spider just sat there, and the woman didn't go for her weapons. "What about me?" she asked. "Where's my share?"
"We've only got 3 more between us," whined Roland.
"Hand them over." Tariq shrugged and made a show of searching his pouch before he reluctantly pulled out some more coins. The woman took them with a disgruntled expression.
"You could give one to her," suggested Roland to the dog-faced guard. "Then you'd have 4 each." "I already got mine," said the first guard.
"Give me one," said the woman.
They started to argue. Roland moved off, making the hand sign that meant
hurry to Abeka. But she needed no sign, nor did the others. They all rushed through the gate, leaving the guards bickering behind them. Past the gate, Abeka was surprised to see dozens of tiny houses built up close to the city wall, which wouldn't be allowed in any of the cities she had seen in Yura. Row after row of narrow doorways opened onto tiny hutches, barely large enough for chickens, but in which whole families lived. People squabbled and fought over scraps with scrawny dogs that themselves looked more like rats. Continuing along the road, she realized that these areas belonged to the very poor. These roughly made huts with makeshift roofs and walls could be quickly knocked down if the ground in front of the wall needed to be cleared to help defend against an enemy attack. Only they hadn't done it, and now the conquerors had taken over. "Ugh," said Abeka, crinkling her nose with distaste at a strong smell of sewage. Such uncleanliness would never have been tolerated in her village. "I wanted to get out of the city, but this is even worse." "We will be out into the country soon enough," said Tariq quietly. "We just need to meet the messenger and find out where we need to go." "Is that the inn?" asked Roland, pointing to a large building that stood head and shoulders above the surrounding shacks. It also had a low wall around it to keep the surrounding slum at bay. Above the wooden gate, there was a hanging sign showing a bright crescent moon rising from behind a mountain. "It is," said Tariq, "but we don't want to stay here. I'll seek out the messenger, and we'll be on our way as quickly as possible." They walked under the inn sign and through the gate, and then stopped in their tracks. The courtyard of the inn was full of soldiers. Dozens of them were sitting around on upturned barrels. Even worse, there were dozens of spirit animals as well. The whole place was an enemy camp. Chapter 5. Inn of the Bright Moon. Connor hesitated and began to turn around, but Tariq took his arm and held him firm. "Running will only make us look suspicious," he whispered. Roland agreed. "Got to pretend we belong here, even though we don't. Keep going." Hunching close together, the quartet moved toward the front door of the inn, along the narrow lane between the soldiers. Heads turned as they passed, conversation stopped, and they felt the stares of both humans and animals. A thin snake, coiled around the neck of a soldier, tasted the air with its flickering tongue and aimed its unblinking eyes at them, as though sensing something odd about them. Two mismatched weasels stopped fighting to stare. Connor braced himself to release Briggan at the first sign that they had been discovered. Hiding was all very well, but he wasn't afraid to fight if there was no other choice. Just as Tariq put his foot down on the first of the 3 steps to the front door, it was flung open. A tall man in a not terribly white apron, with a belt of cups around his waist, indicating he was the innkeeper, appeared in the doorway and threw up his arms in relief. "Puppeteers!" he cried. "I sent for actors, minstrels, anything, but puppeteers are perfect. How much for a show, and can you start very soon now?" Tariq looked momentarily startled, and Roland stepped into the breach. "1 silvers and dinner," he said, "but we'll need it to be a bit darker for the show. Say the 6th hour." "Done!" exclaimed the innkeeper. He looked around at the seated soldiers, who had returned to their card games, drinks and conversation. "Name's Bozeng. I've got a troop of 50 conquerors billeted here, bored as anything and needing distraction, and not from breaking up my furniture, if you please. Come in." He turned around and clattered back inside. Abeka pulled at Roland's sleeve. "Have you gone crazy?" she whispered. "We don't know how to do a show." Connor nodded vigorously in agreement. He had helped the ship's carpenter build the puppets, but had never once tried to use them. "We won't have to," whispered Tariq. "Roland knows what he's doing. Follow his lead." Roland glowed at the senior Greencloak's words, and Connor felt a twinge of jealousy. The puppets were his idea. Without them, they'd have been captured already. Inside the inn, there was a large common room full of even more soldiers. Bozeng indicated a slightly raised platform down at the far end.
"You can put your screen across the front there," he said. "There's hooks in the ceiling. I will announce the performance. What is the name of your troupe?" "Moston's Most Marvellous Puppets," said Roland. "We'll set the screen up and get ready, but like I said, it's still too light." "We can close the shutters," said Bozeng.
He looked around again. The soldiers were sitting and drinking, occasionally bursting into vigorous argument over cards and dice. Many of the soldiers showed the tattoos of the marked, but the spirit animals were either in dormant form or sticking close to their partners. From the way Bozeng's eyes darted around, he expected the conquerors to cut loose any second.
"We need the time to prepare everything," said Roland easily.
He led the way over to the platform and set down his pack, helped Rebecca with hers, and took off the rolled-up sail.
"You carry on with whatever you need to do, Master Bozeng."
The innkeeper looked troubled, but bustled away and started calling out to one of his serving people.
"More of everything for our honoured guests," he called out.
"Get the screen up," hissed Roland to Rebecca, but Connor knew he meant him as well. Roland just wouldn't look him in the eye.
Moston, I think we should get some fire buckets to have by the big lantern. Can you help me find some?"
Tariq nodded, and the two of them slipped off into the kitchens. "Come on then," said Rebecca encouragingly to Connor. He started and realised he was still thinking about Roland ignoring him. Wool gathering, which was never helpful. He started to unroll the sail, Rebecca cheerfully grabbing the other end and pitching in. They had just managed to get the sail hung up evenly across the end of the common room, after some trial and error, and set up the big lantern on a stool behind it, when Tariq and Roland returned. Both were carrying large wooden buckets slopping over with water. Shielded by the screen from the soldiers, the four gathered around the packs and started to pull out the pieces of the shadow puppets.
"I found the messenger," whispered Tariq. "We worked together a few years ago, and he recognized me the moment we went out back. He's working here as a cook. He has good news. One of our finest people, a green cloak named Lishay, has found Dinesh. We have to meet up with Lishay as soon as possible. The rendezvous is deep in Ko-Kenzit, quite a distance from here. Fortunately, we can get a good part of the way there by canal and river. The jungles of Ko-Kenzit are not easy to travel otherwise."
"If we leave the puppets and everything, we'll make better time," said Rebecca.
"Agreed,"
said Connor, who was heartily sick of lugging the heavy screen around.
"We can sneak out the back way and be miles away before anyone notices."
"That's my plan exactly," said Roland with a satisfied smirk. "I told you we wouldn't have to do a show."
They emptied their packs and left the puppets leaning up against a dirty wall. Using the distraction of a particularly bawdy song, which had the entire inn joining in for its chorus, they proceeded in a line, with Tariq at the lead, through the kitchens and out a small back gate. They found themselves in an alley that was stacked with empty barrels, broken pots and other rubbish from the inn.
"See? Easy," said Roland, still grinning.
"We were lucky," said Tariq in cautionary tones. "I think that innkeeper was right. He will have trouble there tonight."
"Particularly without a puppet show," said Connor.
"I feel a bit sorry for him."
"Hey, we have to do whatever's necessary for our mission," said Roland. "Most of us, anyway."
"What do you mean by that?" asked Connor, bristling.
"Just what I said," said Roland easily.
"I know what you meant," said Connor.
"Roland's right," said Rebecca, although she cast an apologetic glance at Connor. "Within reason. Beware the lion hunter becoming the lion."
"What does that mean?"
Roland asked. "It's an old saying from my village," she told him. "Some people turn into the thing they're fighting if they're not careful."
"Who's not being careful? We're safe now, aren't we?"
"Not yet," said Tariq. "There's a barge waiting for us, but the canal is along the street and then down the hill. Without the puppets,
we will be dangerously exposed.
Roland may have lived in a city, but Connor had lived in a town, and people were the same there. He was determined to show Roland that not everything he said was stupid.
"Pick up something that could be cargo we're taking to the barge," he said, indicating the rubbish.
He picked up a small barrel himself. Roland took a rice wine pitcher, and Rebecca a sack that she turned around to hide the hole in the back. Tariq chose a crate, putting his pack in it before hoisting it up on his shoulder. They were just setting out when a slurred voice called out from the back gate.
"Where you going? Supposed to do a show?"
It was a soldier, one of the conquerors, a particularly large soldier, standing in the doorway and scowling. Roland, Rebecca, and Connor moved as one, without the need for speech. Connor stepped to the side and swung his barrel in front of the soldier's feet, sending the man tumbling forward. Rebecca opened her sack and jammed it over the soldier, muffling his shouts, and Roland hit his sack-wrapped head with the rice wine pitcher. The man collapsed to the ground, unconscious.
"Well done," said Tariq.
The three youngsters looked at each other. Roland grinned at Connor. For a moment, Connor felt a kind of weight lifting from his spirit, and he hesitantly began to smile back. Then Roland seemed to remember himself. He frowned, and Connor too turned the beginnings of his smile into a look of concentration. There was no time for congratulations anyway. The sound of raised voices was growing louder from inside the inn. Pausing only to pick up a new barrel, sack, and pitcher, they sped off along the alley. Behind them, the door crashed open.
"Hey!"
"This way," said Tariq, turning left along a lane that was barely larger than the alley. Connor heard something smash behind them, but he didn't turn to see. Heavy footsteps followed them. He had to concentrate on keeping ahead of them. A whistle sounded, 2 rising pitches, and suddenly there were conquerors ahead of them too, at the end of the lane, alerted by their compatriots' signal.
"Through here."
Tariq ducked into an entranceway and along a cobbled area full of pigs. The stones were slippery underfoot.
"Yeah,"
said Tariq, slapping one of the pigs on the rump as he passed.
"Yeah."
They ducked into another lane, and this time Connor did glance over his shoulder. 2 conquerors were hot on their heels. The first tripped over a pig. The second slipped on the cobbles. Connor grinned and returned his attention forward to where Tariq was hurrying the others along the lane. The grin was replaced by a gasp of panic as a conqueror suddenly burst through a doorway immediately to Connor's right, beefy hands clutching for his hair.
"Got you!"
Connor ducked and threw the barrel at his face. The man was between him and Roland, so without even thinking, Connor backpedaled and went the other way up the lane, as fast as his legs could carry him. The conqueror roared and followed, moving heavily but with frightening speed. At the end of the lane, there was no time for active thought. His heart racing, Connor turned right, ending up close to the wall again, and there were people everywhere. He ducked and wove between them, but he could hear the conqueror right behind him, people shouting and screaming as he pushed them aside. Fear helped him run faster. He could almost feel his pursuer's breath on his neck, and his shoulders tensed with the expectation of a sudden blow, maybe even a knife thrust. Ahead, 2 more conquerors stepped into his path and raised their weapons. Excited spirit animals, a cat and a frill-necked lizard, hissed. Connor couldn't fight them on his own. He had to find some way to escape. But where? There were only walls around him, the thin, narrow walls of Shin Dai's shantytown. That gave him an idea. These places weren't constructed with solid stone like back home. The walls were literally paper thin here. He could burst through them if he had to. But as well as paper, there were hanging screens made of cloth. He pushed one aside and ran through to the home behind it. A young man was sitting at a clay pot, stirring something thin and gruel-like over a miserly flame. He looked up in surprise.
"Sorry,"
gasped Connor, crashing through to the next house along. Behind him, he heard paper walls tearing. He paused for a moment to gasp for air, his eyes wide and searching, hoping he would see some new way out. A small hand gripped his. Connor looked down and saw a young child tugging at him, as though telling him to follow. Behind her, an elderly woman nodded and made an urgent shooing gesture. The girl pulled his hand harder. The shouting and the wall-destroying noises were too loud and too close. Connor let the girl lead him away. She took him at a skipping run through a series of cloth and paper tunnels, deeper into the shantytown. People watched him as he passed through, led by the girl along a maze he could never have navigated on his own. None of them interfered. Slowly, the sound of pursuit fell behind them. Still the girl tugged his hand. He followed her until they reached the edge of the shantytown, where she carefully peeled back a cloth the colour of mud. The light seemed bright to Connor's eyes, and he had to blink twice before he understood what he was seeing. It was the canal. A long barge floated on it, heavily laden with cloth bales. And there, next to it, were his friends. Their faces were set with tension, and Rebecca kept glancing up the street, searching for Connor. Roland looked particularly worried. Or was that simply annoyance? Connor couldn't tell. "Thank you," he told the girl, before running to join them. He wished he had some of the silvers Tariq had given the guards at the gate, but she didn't stick around to accept his thanks. With a quick smile, she turned and disappeared into the shadows. Connor stepped out into the light, waved, and hurried across the exposed thoroughfare to join the others at the side of the barge that would take them into the jungle, toward Dinesh and the slate elephant talisman.